At 6:47 on November 3, 1944, Private First Class Michael Donovan lay half hidden in the hollow of a ruined bakery on the eastern edge of Metz, the ruined ovens and collapsed rafters forming a jagged silhouette against the fog that had not yet burned off. He watched a lane of rubble through the blacked-out circle of his scope. Somewhere to his left, too close for comfort, a man in a German smock breathed, cleaned a bolt, and then vanished into a doorway. The world was narrowed to the chrome edge of glass and the steadying of a single breath. The patrol across the square had lost men that month. The battalion had lost snipers. The pattern was plain enough to a man who kept count. If you appreciate careful, forgotten histories like this one, please like and subscribe to see more stories restored from the margins. Donovan had a list in his head, 23 names, not all of them written anywhere, some still warm in his memory. Corporal James Bradley, a wide-shouldered farm kid who had joked about returning to harvest hay, had crouched behind the same bakery wall 3 nights earlier and been shot from an angle Bradley had said he never considered. Private Robert Chen had bled out in a doorway after a long, terrible silence that nobody present wanted to remember. They all kept seeing the way he had tried to hold his face from the mud. Week after week the pattern repeated. Men posted for observation were being taken from flanking positions. Men who judged the lane ahead correctly but were exposed from an unexpected quarter. The word among the 27th Infantry sharpshooters grew weighty. Double positions. The Germans were using pairs, one man forward to draw the eye and one man to walk in from the side. It was a lesson that killed. Donovan had been promoted the hard way. He was not a talker. His voice had the narrowed cadences of someone who listened more than he spoke. In sniper school he learned patience, zeroing, wind calls, the arithmetic of distance reduced to muscle memory and hush. In Metz, the arithmetic turned ugly. Every death felt like a failure of calculation, and Donovan had begun to feel accountable in a way that reached beyond rank. Not commanders chastening, but the quiet tally of men who would not stand to laugh again under a night sky. He kept his observations. He drew rough diagrams in the margins of a cigarette pack. Houses in broken lines, sandbagged windows, the angles the enemy liked to use. He was methodical. He measured by sight and sound rather than by tools. His world was the little tube he looked through and the air that entered that tube. The problem was simple to describe and stubborn to solve. The scope, for all its precision, behaved like a tunnel. It granted a magnified view ahead and almost nothing around. A man could stare into the throat of a street for a full minute and be blind to a shadow moving from the flank. This tunnel vision, the men joked about it quietly, calling it a toilet paper roll at times, had literal consequences. A sniper could count the cracks in the plaster ahead and miss the flash of a flanker's muzzle. For Donovan, the losses were not abstractions. Bradley had been paired with him on a patrol that returned without him. He remembered the sudden, choked sound of the radio when the message came, killed instantly. Chen's death had been worse to carry. The long, helpless minutes while medics tried. The wet smell after rain when the stretcher was carried out. Those memories lodged behind Donovan's sternum and pressed. Guilt, the kind that made sleep thin, settled over him in the evenings when the billets smelled of stew and tobacco. It was a guilt edged with a practical, unromantic question. How could the men be made safer? He started in private, in the hours between curfew and the dawn. Not with plans filed up the chain, but with the small, crude experiments of men who must make do. He scavenged what ordinary things war left behind. A sliver of glass, a cracked watch face, a fragment of polished metal. He did not write them down. The modifications he tried were clumsy and tentative, not because he lacked skill, but because he refused to make anything that might become dangerous if it failed. He was careful about that. His affection for the men under him did not include a desire to endanger them with harebrained tinkering. The device he built was never a formal invention. It was a field expedient, something that, when placed near the scope, caught a corner of the world the scope ignored. He thought of the mirror only in metaphors at first, a second eye, a conscience for the rifle, and the object lived at the junction of necessity and accident. He would later call it crude, and the men would laugh at the term, but the crude thing made a difference not by mechanical genius, but by changing what a man could see. Donovan kept the details of how it was mounted to himself and to the few who needed to know. He refused to draw measurements in the dirt or to teach a class. What he offered was demonstration and an explanation of effect, peripheral awareness. "It gives you a look to the side," he told Sam Martinez once, the younger private who watched Donovan's hands with that patient kind of curiosity that belongs to those who learn by seeing. Not a map, just a glimpse. Martinez squinted at the improvised device, then at the lane. "You mean you can see them coming?" he asked. Donovan looked at him, the barn-light smear on his cheekbone. "You can see what you don't expect." The first night they used it in an engagement was not theatrical. There were no trumpetings, no dramatic proclamations. It was November in Metz. The fog sat low like a blanket. Someone had thrown over the town. Two teams moved into positions around a factory half ruined, a place the men had been cursing at for a week because of the way riflemen seemed to sprout behind its fractured walls. Donovan's post was already cold. He settled into the echoing cavity of the building, the scope tube steadying his world into a manageable circle. The mirror sat at his left, not forward, not even really part of the sight line, more like a small, dull eye waiting. The first shot that night changed everything with the same unsentimental economy of war. A German forward spotter stepped into the lane, and Donovan's scope drank him in. The familiar slow mechanics of sight and breath. He had time to take the shot that would end the immediate threat. Then a glint caught the corner of his eye, a small flash on the periphery that did not belong to the forward lane. The mirror reflected a sliver of coat and muzzle, the angle of a man coming in from cover. There was no time for calculation, only a quick redirection of attention and a clipped word into the field telephone. "Flanker, 3 o'clock," Donovan whispered. It was the sort of shorthand they used when seconds meant life. Somewhere else on the line, a man who had not been expecting a threat from that quarter heard the call, turned, and fired. The two threats, the forward and the flank, were neutralized within minutes. By morning, the platoon recorded a tally of 6 German snipers who had been sighted and engaged that prior night, men who would have otherwise held the battalion in a slow, lethal choke. Word moved in a way the Army could not always control, from foxhole to foxhole, from one man to the next. Sergeant Frank Wilson, who had taken a liking to Donovan's sober manner, was the first to insist the idea spread beyond their rooftop. "If it'll change one man's chances," Wilson said, a week after the initial night, "put it where it'll be seen." He did not carry papers or forms. He carried practice and habit. He taught another man quietly, left a makeshift device on a crate for a comrade to borrow, showed somebody how to place it for effect without explaining how to fashion it. The rumor grew. It saved men. The spread was messy and unorthodox. Notebooks in formal channels recorded nothing about who had first suggested the change. It was, in the Army's slow language, a field expedient adopted by troops in contact. Captain Robert Hayes, the company's commanding officer, moved differently. Hayes was the kind of leader who read the faces of the men and then looked the bureaucracy in the eyes. He could see what the modification meant beyond its outward simplicity. He also understood that if a practice reduced casualties, his duty was to preserve it and, where possible, to protect the soldiers who used it. Hayes called a meeting in the back room of the battalion's command post, a place that smelled of canned coffee and grease. He had Donovan brought in, not summoned, but asked. "You did this?" Hayes asked plainly. Donovan shrugged, uneasy at the attention. He was not someone who wanted to sit under praise. "It started with something small," Donovan said. "If it helps, it helps." Hayes, who would later be frank about the moral dimensions of command, chose to pocket the credit and put safety first. He authorized informal distribution of the devices across the sniper teams and arranged for a formal evaluation to be conducted at the nearest proving ground. That was the responsible thing to do: measure, confirm, and then codify. Yet Hayes also knew how the Army's paperwork could eat names and history. He tried, in private, to ensure Donovan would not be lost in that process. "You won't be left unrecognized," Hayes told him, and Donovan believed him because Hayes spoke the way leaders do, less with promises than with plans. In December, an inspector from the division stopped by. Men in neat uniforms and civilian lab coats came and watched through field telescopes and took notes on clipboards. They observed night drills, recorded the difference in casualties where the practice had been used, and made the impartial sorts of comments in their stern voice. By January 1945, a formal evaluation had been filed and the procedure recommended for broader adoption. The reports, written in bureaucratic prose, lauded the improved survivability of sniper teams working in pairs and using additional peripheral devices. What they did not include, in any revelatory way, was a line tracing that success back to the quiet hands that first fitted a sliver of glass beside a sight in a ruined bakery. The evaluation team produced a report that would travel up channels and eventually become the public record. Donovan's name was absent from that report. He had not been in the minutes nor cited in the margins. Hayes had argued otherwise, had argued for an attachment in the file that named him, but the gears of administration have their appetite for simplicity. A solution born in the field was generalized into a recommended practice. Command recognized the efficacy without footnoting the human source. In the years that followed, the modification was referred to in manuals and after-action studies as a field expedient, without origin attached. The erasure troubled Donovan more than he would show, not because he sought credit, he had no taste for medals, but because the men he had watched die had deserved their names attached to any change that might have spared them. There is a difference between fame and record. Donovan wanted the ledger to remember those who had paid the price. He took some comfort in the way his comrades referred to the devices in private. Donovan's Eye became an informal nickname among the snipers, and in the way Sam Martinez had pressed a hand on his shoulder and said simply, "You saved my life." That, for Donovan, was enough in quiet moments, when he allowed himself to be human. The spread of the idea kept a practical rhythm. A man used it, he lived, he taught a friend, the friend used it, and the friend taught another. Innovations in war traveled like gossip until they reached formal ears. Hayes's initiative to forward the evaluation placed the practice beyond their company. The Proving Grounds endorsement made it durable. Once an institutional stamp was placed on a practice, training cadres could incorporate it, doctrine writers could mention it, and the method could migrate to other fronts. The cost in lives had already been paid in METs. The benefit would be paid in survival elsewhere. But adoption did not mean recognition for a private first class who had refused attention. Donovan left Europe at war's end with the knowledge that the practice had likely saved lives, and with a nameless ledger of gratitude and grief. He returned to the United States and to a quieter life in Pennsylvania, to a factory where the machines made no personal distinctions between the men who tended them. He found work on an assembly line, hands that had been steady with a rifle now steady with a wrench. He married. He had a son who grew up with stories of a quiet father who seldom spoke of his years overseas. Donovan liked the city library and the way books smelled on rainy afternoons. He liked the steady, ordinary repetition of days that had no urgent decisions. Recognition came in small measures. Hayes, when he visited on leave, wrote in careful letters that he had done his best to secure Donovan's name in the record. He sometimes asked Donovan to come to regimental dinners and speak, but Donovan declined.
He had never wanted to be a public figure. An official commendation arrived eventually in the mail, not for innovation but for service. It was the kind of paper that made a man fold it carefully and put it in a drawer with gloves and old ration coupons. Hayes would later be photographed at a reunion, smiling in a uniform he had not worn in 30 years, and Donovan would watch the photograph in the paper with a calm that masked a complicated pride. Decades later, a historian visiting the archives would find the dry reports and the gaps and begin to ask questions. In 1987, a researcher turned from an atlas of reports to a sheaf of wartime letters to diary entries tucked among mess hall receipts. Names began to reappear in ways the official record had not recorded. Mentions in correspondence, in the margins of men's notes, a passing remark in a sergeant's account. Those who had served together started to write more candidly in the quiet of old age. Memory, which had once been pressed and fearful, softened into narrative. The historian's curiosity led to an article in 1989 that stitched the fragments together, a description of how an improvised device had changed outcomes in a small but decisive theater of the war. The article named Donovan as the origin in a way the formal evaluation had never done. When the piece appeared, Donovan read it with a careful, almost embarrassed pleasure. He had not expected newspapers or accolades. What he felt instead was the odd restoration of a ledger item to its right column. Letters began to come from men he had not seen since 1945. Simple notes saying, "I remember," and "thank you." The kind of small grace that accumulates like pebbles to shore up loneliness. Hayes, too, lived to see the article. In 1992, he made a trip to a nursing home in Pennsylvania where the former private worked part-time at a maintenance desk. He arrived with a folder of old orders and with that weary, kind look of a man who had carried obligations differently. Hayes sat across from Donovan in a sunlit common room and spoke plainly about the way the Army had often swallowed the origins of necessity. They took the method and made it general, Hayes said. They forgot the hand that first put the glass to work. Donovan accepted the words without need for correction. The meeting between them was small and private. Hayes produced a modest certificate, hardly the parade Donovan never wanted, but the gesture mattered to both. The company commander had preserved not only lives, but a sense of moral bookkeeping. Donovan's later years were not marked by ceremonies. He did not seek monuments. He kept a box of old letters and a single photograph of a crumbling bakery that had become, in his memory, a place where something practical and human had changed the future for men at the edge. He went to the post office, to the market, to the river where he once taught his son to fish. He died in 2001, quietly, after a life that had been practical from its beginning. His funeral was small. Some of the men who had served with him came, older and slowed. They did not speak loudly. They stood with hands folded and with the sort of silence that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with reverence. The legacy of what happened in Metz was more complicated than an entry in a manual. The change saved lives. It reshaped how men thought about observation and awareness under fire. It also became a study in whose names endure and whose are lost. Many innovations of war are anonymous because the field demands quick fixes and the archive demands tidy summaries. Donovan's contribution slid, briefly, between both worlds. Anonymous in the official report, present in the memories of those he had saved. Recovered in fragments by a historian decades later. There are moral lines here that do not map to clean edges. Donovan had to balance obedience with improvisation. He had to decide whether to risk censure for a field modification, and whether saving a single man justified the irregularity. Hayes had to weigh institutional truth against the need to shield those under his command from red tape that could be lethal in its delay. The Army, in its vastness, often recorded efficacy and not authorship. The machinery of war preferred reproducible practices over messy histories, a fact that left men like Donovan lesser known despite their real effects.
If there is a quiet lesson, it is not that one man changed the world with a polished invention. It is that a practical act, born of grief, made under rubble, applied with modesty, can transform outcomes and deserve remembering. Donovan's was not a clean heroism of speech or parade. It was a small, stubborn, humane insistence that lives could be protected if men paid attention to the blind spots and took the risk to patch them. In the later articles and in reunion halls, the story got softened or sketched in different ways, sometimes as lore, sometimes as homage. But the core remained. A useless little piece of reflective glass had been turned into a second eye, saving men who otherwise would have been caught by angles they had not watched. When veterans spoke of the nights in Metz, they spoke also of fog and cordite and the cold seam of breath in their helmets. They spoke of Bradley and Chen by name. They spoke, more quietly, of small mercies. A glance that found a flank, a warning passed over a field telephone, a comrade who had his hand on their shoulder in the dark. Those were the things that layered themselves into Donovan's life and into the quiet record of the war. Metz, that winter, remained a broken town that had demanded ingenuity from whoever stood in its ruins. The mirror was a practical answer to a persistent danger. The men who used it lived to tell about it. The Army eventually incorporated the lesson into a broader set of practices for sniper teams and observation posts, and the reduction in flank losses was counted in reports and graphs. But counting lives saved does not always equal naming the hand that saved them. For Donovan, the consolation came not from reports, but from a slow trail of human thanks and the knowledge that men like Martinez lived to have children and grandchildren. In a photograph taken decades later for a local paper, Donovan stood in front of the factory where he had worked after the war. His face was lined, his hair thinner, his hands folded around a cup of coffee. He wore no medals. Beside him, in the caption, the reporter noted the 1949 evaluation and the obscure reference that had elided Donovan's name. The historian who had traced it back smiled at the correction, and a small paragraph restored some balance. It was not the kind of vindication that makes headlines for long, but it moved the ledger a small degree toward truth. There was a last quiet irony. The very sameness that allowed the Army to scale the device across units, their preference for codified, repeatable procedures, also made it possible to forget the messy origin. Systems forget the hands that first altered them. Still, men remembered. In reunions, it was always the men themselves who kept the story lively, telling it in the half-joking, half-honest way veterans do. Here's the thing that kept me alive, and here's the one who kept me alive. Donovan's son kept his father's few letters and the photograph of the bakery. When the son grew old enough to understand that small gestures in life sometimes outlast formal records, he placed the photograph in a frame, and, in moments when grandchildren asked about the old man's quiet, told the story in the exact terms it deserved. Not as an invention worthy of glory, but as an act that mattered because it saved men. There is an argument in histories like this that wars are also laboratories, grim and urgent. Yet laboratories are not always clean, and innovation does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives as the stubborn correction of a man who refused to accept the ledger as final. Donovan's story is one of those corrections. A stupid accident, the phrase people sometimes used in private with half a laugh, that exposed a hidden weakness no army had noticed. The accident was not a failing. It was the pivot that widened vision and bought breath. By the time the story entered the pages of local papers and later specialized journals, Donovan had already been living a life that preferred small certainties to loud recognition. He had loved his son, he had worked steady hours, he had kept his head down when attention came. That temperament, which might have seemed like modesty, had been in part the product of wartime choices. The man who sees what must be fixed and fixes it without ceremony. There was finally a communal reckoning about credit and memory. Veterans associations petitioned for better ways to record field innovations.
Historians argued for the inclusion of oral testimony in official reports. The small recalibrations did not change the past, but they changed how the past was told. Donovan's name found its way back into footnotes and into the margins of a few training manuals that now acknowledged, with a quiet line, the origin of the practice in Metz. That acknowledgment was small, perhaps insufficient to some, but to a man who had spent his life patching holes, it was enough to close one ledger. In the end, the story kept its sober tone. Not a tale of triumph, but of necessary ingenuity, of small mercies, and of the messy mathematics by which a life spent tending to the blind spots of others can ripple outward. The ruined bakery had been a place where a peripheral glint changed the calculus of exposure. The men who had survived because of it went on to live ordinary lives, to plant gardens and teach children to tie knots, and to tell at reunions of the fog that turned for a moment into clarity. The trick
the way a mirror caught a sliver of an angle and made a man notice, remained too simple to be a legend and too consequential to be ignored. It was an answer the battalion could not have paid its way to discover at headquarters. It had to be found among the men who faced danger, who kept count, and who were willing to bend rules when lives were at stake. Donovan's hand, uncredited in cold files, but remembered by those who mattered, was the only kind of legacy that fit him: practical, quiet, decisive. Outside of the reports and the dry language of evaluations, the emotional truth was this: in a theater of fog and rubble, a small human improvisation reduced the ledger of grief. It did not erase the names already lost. It honored them by saving the names that came after. The winter eventually thawed, and Metz grew still in its own way. The practice diffused, lives were spared, and a story moved from foxhole to report to footnote and finally to the kind of obituary that a man like Donovan would have preferred: short, factual, and mindful of the men who had stood with him. The accident that exposed a weakness had been no accident of heroism. It had been an incidental invention born of necessity and sorrow. It changed outcomes, and in the slow work of memory, it found its place. There came a day, not marked by trumpets but by folding chairs, when a handful of men gathered beneath a dented canopy at the edge of the old training ground. It was early autumn. The light was thin and honest. Someone had arranged a crude plaque on a stand, bronze, unadorned, the text more plain than proud, and a coffee urn steamed in the corner as if to keep watch. Donovan's son stood near the front, his palm steady despite the tremor that lived in the rest of him. Around him were faces weathered in different ways: a corporal who still kept his medals in a battered tin, a medic whose hands trembled less than his laugh, a man who had been saved by a hand that bent a rule back in Metz. Speeches were small. They were meant to be small. The commanding officer spoke in the language of reports: short sentences, measured tone. And then an old sergeant simply said the names of the men who had not come home. No one attempted to turn sorrow into pageantry. Donovan's son stepped forward when it was his turn. He did not ask for applause. He spoke as one does when the thing to be said is not about vanity, but about accountancy of the heart. This was a man who fixed what he found broken, he said. He did not want his name in lights. He wanted the lights to work. That was the kind of tribute Donovan would have liked: literal, unadorned, useful. After the formalities, people lingered. They traded stories: short, factual, correct as a ledger. The sergeant had once been saved, checked the plaque with a sober thumb, then slipped a small photograph from his wallet and compared it to the framed picture. Donovan's son had brought the burnt facade of the bakery, the curling smoke, the corner mirror caught like a shard of sun. The photograph fit into the story like a key into a lock. It did not open anything magisterial, only a door to memory. In the months that followed, small changes accrued. The battalion library expanded a shelf for oral histories. A training exercise included a briefing that quoted, in passing, a margin note about improvisation under duress. Veterans who had once sat in bars and muttered grudges began to meet with young officers and speak plainly about what they had learned at the edge of things. Donovan's name, once marginal, moved into the space between a footnote and a quotation. It did not erupt into celebrity, it became a reference. The son kept living in the cadence Donovan had taught him, steady hours, small certainties. He worked with his hands, planted roses in a strip of yard, and taught his grandchildren how to tie knots the way his father had taught him, patient, with a correction offered as if it were a kindness. On Sundays, when the children were quiet enough to listen, he would take the photograph down from its place on the mantel and set it where the light in the front room would strike the glass at the right angle. They would ask questions. Their questions were blunt and honest. "Was he a hero?" a granddaughter once asked, staring hard at the black and white ruin. "He saved men," the son answered, and the difference between the two phrases was a lesson in measure. He did not inflate the deed into myth. He did not lessen it into ledger. The children learned to hold both things at once, the smallness of a man's daily work and the gravity of what that work could mean to others. There were quieter moments, too. One winter afternoon, the son walked the lane that led past the bakery's foundation. The building was a skeleton of brick now, a community garden edging its boundaries, potatoes and beans where ovens had once smoked. An old woman tending the beds looked up and nodded recognition at the photograph tucked into the son's coat. They spoke of ordinary things, weather, crops, a rooster that would not go to roost. When the son left, he placed a folded copy of the photograph beneath a stone by the garden gate, not as a monument, but as a marker, private, small, enough. The strange arithmetic of memory did its work gradually. Where Donovan had once been a line in a file, he became a presence in the ways that matter most. A method remembered, a life recounted, a photograph that arrived at hearths and museum drawers alike. Those who had been saved by that improvisation attended weddings, funerals, and taught children to prime. Knot lines and mend nets. The ledger of loss remained. It had not been erased. But a new column, grace if one must name it, had been added, thin and patient and quietly accounted for. In the end, the image that returned most often was not of medals or plaques, but of a sliver of light. Men who had been there described the moment as simply as a man might describe the weather. A glint, a reflection, an angle noticed. It was modest, almost stupid in its simplicity. It was, though, what had changed the calculus. On winter mornings when the house was still, Donovan's son would stand by the front window and watch the light make geometry on the framed photograph. He would smile in a small way and think not of glory, but of the men who kept breathing because someone had bothered to bend a rule and trust his hands. The photograph sat in the light, and for all its smallness, it held the tidy power of proof that a life lived toward practical ends could, without fanfare, widen the margin of survival for others. Outside, the world went on with its complex accounts. Inside, a pane of glass caught a sliver of the day and, like the thing it remembered, turned it into something that lasted.